This is Wellness by Designs, and I'm your host, Andrew Whitfield Cook. Joining us today is Beth Bundy, who's a naturopath and functional medicine practitioner. And today we'll be discussing the nervous system, the cortisol response, and how we can support our patients. Welcome to Wellness by Designs. Beth, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Andrew.
Great to be chatting again. It's been a while. We spoke about gut health last time, I remember.
Yes. Now we're delving into the brain today.
Today. Now, for our listeners, for our audience, we delved into Beth's clinical history last time, so we'll leave that for you to delve into that podcast. It was measuring gut health markers, so you can look that up previously. But today, let's get straight down to business, Beth. We're talking about stress. So take us through a normal stress response. How do we segment it? What stages are there?
Yeah, so I just thought I'll just remind everybody that it was over 70 years ago that Hans Selye developed his theory of general adaptation syndrome, which is a stress model that explains the body's physiological response to stress. Now, these stress responses are divided into three stages, which is alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Now, so during the initial phase, the body's reaction to stress or alarm is the fight or flight mechanism, which is triggered in order to prepare the body for physical activity, allowing it to defend itself against potential threat, the tiger's coming. Of course, now that's a whole lot different. We don't have tigers, we just have deadlines, we have family stress, we have work stresses, COVID stresses. There's, always a new virus around the corner. So the body reacts with this fight or flight response and activates the sympathetic nervous system and releases your adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol. So that's all well and good. Then the second stage of the body stress response is when the lowering level of stress due to the body's allocation of energy to damaged tissue, and as a result, the stress is minimized to it, and the body manages a bit better. Parasympathetic nervous system returns many of the normal functions to normal levels, and the body focuses its resources against the stressor, or the perceived stressor. You've got to remember blood glucose levels are affected, so they remain high, and cortisol and adrenaline continue to circulate at elevated levels, but outwardly, would appear normal. Obviously, there's an increase in heart rate, blood pressure and breathing, and this is usually not correct breathing. So people often shallow breathe when they're like this, and of course that perpetuates more stress, and to the body. So basically the body is still on red alert. It's still the meerkat not in the headlights, because meerkats don't see headlights. It's the rabbit in the headlights still. And then finally, in the exhaustion phase, the body goes, I'm over this. I can't be doing this anymore. I'm depleted of energy. And if the cause of stress is not resolved, which often in our modern world, it's just an ongoing saga, health issues then can occur, which we may, see as well, and not directly relate them to stress, but always got to take histories of people, I mean, Selye commented, I'll just have to read this, stress, in addition to being itself, is also the cause of itself and the result of itself. So I thought that's pretty heavy, Hans. Forrest Gump might have just said stupid stress is as stress does, However, even the American Institute of Stress, there is an Institute of Stress, God love the Americans, concede of most of what Selye believed is not entirely correct. And then, of course, for those who are old enough to remember, in the 2000s, Dr. James Wilson, a naturopath and chiropractor from America, brought out a book called Adrenal Fatigue for the 21st century. And basically that became our gospel. That became the textbook of, tired people. And even I, as a relatively new person to practice, that's what I looked. And the book has a long list of symptoms that make sense to you when you have these patients coming in complaining of all those symptoms. So He was really kind of Google before Google. You could actually Google, Dr. Wilson, your symptoms and go adrenal fatigue. And as I said, most of the patients that I see, and I would say that that's a general population, could tick a lot of those boxes, But what we need to remember is the adrenal fatigue moniker is actually absent from most peer-reviewed literature and is not recognised by the Endocrinology Society, who claim there is no hard evidence of its existence. So I think we definitely need to be mindful of this to be considered, credible practitioners, that we might need to change the word, because the original three-stage model defined the progression of stress as adrenal stress, adrenal fatigue, adrenal exhaustion. Yeah. I think we need to update that stage of, I'm going to call it HPA dysfunction. And so this three-stage model has become a common way of us to explain the progression of the HPA dysfunction or maladaptation to stress, really, using cortisol and DHEA values, okay? So some of these labs doing the test will categorise your patient into a particular stage based on their test results. You need to be mindful that this is computer-driven spit out, the reporting. It is not specifically relevant to your client. That is what you as a practitioner will need to then determine from the results and the symptoms in how that relates to your client. So you just need to be mindful of that. They haven't gone, oh, well, Jenny Smith and her results, this is what's going on with Jenny. It's a very generalised comment to those results, yeah? That makes sense to you?
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
of course, Jenny Smith is not based on any person living or dead.
Correct. And her name will be changed for purposes. Yeah. So now I'm not suggesting we abandon all the stages altogether. I just think we need to look at them as common patterns of point of reference, not as rules. Yeah. So we cannot fit a patient's cortisol result into a neat box and arrive at immediate conclusion, this equals that. Because you need to use your diagnostic, your history-taking skills, in addition to laboratory findings. I think I say this all the time. They complement what you're thinking and what you're, wondering what's happening with this client, because it can definitely be quite different to what you think. So if I can just run through the stages, Andrew, just to remind people of what we're looking at as people go through this. So obviously you have your initial exposure to a stress, typically results in your elevated cortisol, while DHEA levels will remain constant or even decrease, right? Because we're in this initial, the fight or flight. It's like, oh my goodness, the sky is falling. So the cause of the stress and the vitality and age of the patient will determine if DHEA levels will be lower than expected or normal. So a young 25-year-old person who's complaining of, stresses, they should still have a healthy DHEA, whereas someone more like your age, Andrew, would possibly have it a bit lower.
I'm young.
Oh, that's cheeky already. It's too early in the morning to be so cheeky. The assumption is that the adrenal glands are being assaulted by a stressor, which causes a prolonged effect on the adrenal glands to produce excess and prolonged cortisol. Now, the adrenal glands cannot meet this demand indefinitely. There's not the never-ending box of chocolates. And eventually other pathways are compromised to facilitate this cortisol need, yeah? And so this is where the theory of pregnenolone steal comes into play. So are you familiar with that, Andrew? You've heard of this? Yeah. So
I've heard it mentioned, but let's go through it because it's really important.
Yes, absolutely. So the theory is that all steroid hormones are derived from pregnenolone, right, which we do know if you look on your chart of hormones. And pregnenolone is made originally from cholesterol. So you need to remember all our hormones are made from cholesterol. So we do need some cholesterol in our body. We don't need to statin it to death, right? Because, you won't get sick with your cholesterol, but you'll have no hormones to, live a life. So I'm off my soapbox about that now. Now, the elevated secretion of cortisol caused by... All right. Yes. Just take a number. Caused by acute or chronic stress will inevitably result in less pregnenolone available to be a precursor for DHEA production and our other hormones. And that is the need for cortisol to steal that pregnenolone away from the other hormone pathways so it can keep chuffing along, right? Now, while an increase in cortisol is common in early to midterm stress progression, the notion that there's this limited pool, or bucket for all hormones to work with is just incorrect, because the transformation of cholesterol to pregnenolone occurs in the mitochondria, in the mitochondria of each adrenal little cortex cell. And there is no known adrenal pool of pregnenolone just wafting around waiting to be stolen from one cell or another. There is no known mechanism facilitating a transfer of pregnenolone between the mitochondria of different cells. Exactly, the zona reticularis versus the zona fasciculata. There's not a bus that carries them from one to the other. So the current scientific understanding is that prolonged stresses do affect the HPA axis, and cortisol is often initially driven higher. And this is caused by your adrenocorticotropic hormone, or your ACTH production up in here, and your HPA axis activation. So after we see an adaptation by the HPA axis, which can be caused by an adaptation to a specific stressor, that could be the cost of lettuce, for example, or the incomprehensible reason why people hoard toilet paper, a downregulation of the HPA to prevent damage from excess cortisol, or both. So now in stage 2, or as this chronic stress progresses, with no end in sight, it becomes a more permanent downregulation of the cortisol production. So it's not that it parks out and there's none left. Everything is just, okay, let's pull the reins because we can't keep on at a gallop. So not even a canter, let's just trot. And so now you may see these total cortisol levels are still within reference range. So this is where you've got to be cognizant that you'll have someone complaining and has a long list of, life stressors. And then when you do their test, you go, oh, you're in normal reference range, you're fine. Don't be that practitioner. What you don't know is, are they on their way up or are they on their way down? Yeah. Were they previously, and you don't know this if you don't have a previous, test result. Yeah. So you just need to be cognizant of that within, and this is why history is important. Because if they've told you over the last 5 years, they've had, a business has been damaged by, various pandemics, there's been a divorce, there's been blah, 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 blah. This is not, they're in this constant thing still, yeah? And it hasn't gone away. And so, but it may look normal on their test in the reference ranges, So, but this may be when we see DHEA lower than expected, yeah, or changes in the diurnal rhythm. So we should know that cortisol is elevated highly in the morning, or not highly, but it should be the highest in the morning, and then over the day it reduces till at night time it's ready for sleepy time, and then melatonin comes into the place. Yeah, so we have the diurnal cortisol, melatonin.
So can I jump in there? There's a few things.
You may.
Firstly, to make comment, and I need to grandstand as well, and that is this black box syndrome of when a disease exists and when it doesn't. Like, for instance, I've spoken to patients who had a declining testosterone level because they were on a high level of statins, but a GP won't treat them, and indeed they'll send them off to an endocrinologist, and a GP won't treat them until their testosterone gets to, I think it's 5 or 6.
And depending
but you can
on
definitely
age.
see but you can also see their testosterone decreasing over months, not years. We're not talking like an aging decline. We're talking about quite a quick decline. There was the point earlier when you were talking about exhaustion, adrenal exhaustion, quote unquote. And you know, an endocrinologist won't believe in that term because adrenal exhaustion equals Addison's disease. And if you're one
Correct.
mark above that, you do not have Addison's. Therefore, you are quote unquote well. So
Yes.
this is the issue about this black box thing, rather than, as you quite correctly talk about this, the symptom picture over time showing trends.
Mm.
But I have a question. And the question
Yes.
is repeatability of tests. So if you, like, for instance, take somebody's pulse and then you take it tomorrow, well, their pulse can vary depending on an acute stress, or they've just picked up the washing, they've just lifted something and just sat down and they're quite excited or something. So you need to have that repeatability. You know, a pulse should be taken
Yes.
first thing in the morning before food, you know, there's all of these things. Same with
Yes.
blood pressure. What about cortisol? Is
Yes,
it repeatable?
absolutely. Well, no, it's going to be a bit like a pulse because, today you might have good news, or tomorrow you might have bad news.
Hmm.
Or you try and
It's
buy
like a
things at the
5 hour or
supermarket
something
that you can't
response or
get.
something. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Exercise. Yeah, exercise will change your cortisol, right?
yep.
So if you're, so I generally will ask someone not to do it if they're a exercise, junkie. It's like, please do it on a non-exercise day, but do it on a otherwise normal day. So I usually want to get them not on the weekend when they're having a lie down and, you know, um, having a restful weekend. I want them to do it when they are doing it on a normal work day. So because work has a lot to do with how people, so even if they're working from home, they can do it, that they have to, as I said, do it on a normal work day. No exercise, not if they've had a bad night the night before, anything like that. Yeah. What else would I have them not do?
Got
Obviously,
it.
if they're not well. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, there's a perfect one.
Yeah. So if they've got a cold, or they've had a really bad sleep or something, I don't want to do it because that's not generally their norm. I also don't retest too soon because it's, if you're 50 years old and you're coming to see me, I'm not going to fix this in 3 months and let's do the test again. I generally run on how they're feeling and how they're, I find that generally when you treat them with their story and their results, then then the patient is more aware because I explain the results to them so they have an understanding of how they are responding, and they'll go, oh yeah, the
Yeah.
little lights come on. Then they change some things about them and they feel better. So sometimes I don't necessarily think I need to retest to prove that we've done better, because some of these stresses may still be in their world. They're just
Yeah.
responding to them better, if that makes a sense. So
Yeah, absolutely.
maybe if I just explain, if I go through the next, keep going through the stages so we can see how that
Please.
could be. Yeah.
Yep.
So obviously we have that initial stage where everything's on, and then we come into that the more adaptive stage, as a more chronic downregulation. Now, the assumption here is thought that the ACT levels remain high or even increase. However, the adrenal's ability to respond to that is lessened. Yeah. Again, the pregnenolone steal is thought to contribute to maintaining these normal cortisol levels at the expense of DHEA, meaning that this is where you'll start seeing the DHEA levels start to go lower or borderline low. And this is what was originally termed as adrenal fatigue. But of course, that
Yep.
is struck from the record now. We don't use that word. And I usually just tell patients, you're just tired because there's been a lot going on. I no longer use the adrenal fatigue. I just don't use it anymore,
Yeah,
because
I'm
then,
wondering about that vernacular, because it's one of those things. It's kind of like leaky gut syndrome. we know from Brad Leach that it's
Yeah.
incorrect. There is leaky gut, definitely leaky gut. There's definitely intestinal hyperpermeability, and then there's normal intestinal permeability. But there's no syndrome to it. It's just leaky gut.
No.
So similar to this,
yeah.
I'm wondering if this vernacular needs to be worked on to be more physiologically correct. Like if somebody says adrenal burnout, I've never heard of an endocrinologist having an issue with that term, because the burnout part seems to imply some psychological issue. It's really funny, some sort of mental health issue.
Indeed, there is that part of it, because you're when you've got things from, this is the thing, when we can't fix what's happening in people's outside world. Yeah. Because, there's stuff that we can't fix, and perhaps they can't too, they're still living in it. So I always say, if I can support you on how you react to the world around you, that's the best how we can do it. And so as I mentioned before, there's no evidence to suggest that the zona fasciculata, which is where the cortisol is produced in the adrenal glands, becomes insensitive to ACTH or fails to respond over time. The lower cortisol levels are most likely due to the ACTH causing the downregulation of the HPA exit. So it's still, telling the adrenals, please do something, but in a quiet fashion, because, it's a bit like, you're running a marathon versus doing the sprint, So we have to mete out this cortisol and these hormones adequately, so we're not just, burning a hole through something and run out of battery. So it's just quieting the body, because the body always wants to be in a safe place, in homeostasis. So it's the same as thyroid. It doesn't want to be ripping into, hyperthyroid all the time and self-destructing. And that's why, we transfer our T3 into reverse T3. That's another way of the body reining in over, a carry-on sort of thing. So I think the downregulation is a normal reaction to repeated bouts of elevated cortisol. Otherwise, we'd all be, running around doing silly things.
Running around with Cushing's. So that's actually a very important point, Beth, because I remember Mark Donoghue and I discussing this in another podcast about the receptors. The adrenal receptors can be downregulated. But again, does that mean adrenal fatigue, or is that really an adrenal response? So maybe adrenal response should be a more correct terminology.
I think it's the maladaptation. Yeah, I know. I mean, it is. It's a bit like, what do we call it? We've got to call it something so people know. And I think the other thing is too, if you go Googling, you are still going to see adrenal fatigue, this, adrenal fatigue, that, blah, blah, blah. It's everywhere. Right. So people are picking that up. And so if I just don't mention those words, people are generally happy. They don't need to, if they understand why and how we're treating them and seeing themselves in colour on paper, they're happy with that. They don't need to necessarily have a word for what they're thinking, especially if I say, I see this a lot, this is very common and blah, blah. People feel better. I actually had a woman come in last week she was, in her 50s, never been to a naturopath before. So no pressure from me. But it was great, because she was happy because things had been explained to her and she had some understanding then. Then she was, open to whatever I had to help her. Do you know what I mean? And I think I think they just need understanding, not necessarily a catch-all phrase of terminology. The other thing we need to remember is low cortisol levels can be due to increased cortisol binding globulin too. Okay.
Right. So let's go through that.
Yeah. So especially like thyroid has, and sex hormone binding globulins, again, the body will bind some of these things so we don't have all our chips out at the one time. Do you know what I mean? It keeps some in reserve so it can meet that out too. So sometimes if you see, especially in blood, if you're comparing blood to saliva cortisol readings,
Mm.
you know, cortisol may be higher on the blood and free cortisol may be lower. And this could be because of the cortisol binding serum, because you've got to remember in the blood, they will bind up hormones. So, for example, when you are testing, you mentioned testosterone before. You don't just measure testosterone. You know, you need to measure
No.
testosterone and sex hormone binding globulin. So then they can, which is it's an calculation, but then the lab can calculate how much is free testosterone, which is actually what is the stuff that's bioavailable. So we don't have a cortisol, you know, a calculation that they do cortisol and cortisol binding equals this much cortisol. But I just like to get, if I can get blood cortisol, I like to see that, but I still ultimately prescribe and treat off my salivary cortisol. So
Okay.
again, we must
But
remember
I
that
was going to ask.
yeah,
Sorry, Beth. I was going to ask, and forgive me,
yeah,
I was going to ask this earlier when you were talking about DHEA and pregnenolone
yeah,
steel, and that is there any use? I think you've already answered the question, but is there any use in just measuring DHEAS or just measuring testosterone or just measuring these single hormones? We really need to get a sense of the interplay of the hormones and what's happening in
yes,
the
yes, yes. And
biotransformation
if
between the hormones, don't we?
Well, that's right. And if we could get all of those in one go, that'd be lovely. But all of these things cost money. And, you know, we're conscious of doing when I'm doing tests. It's not everything
Mm.
that I'd like. I have to work in with the client and their budget and what is going to give me the most salient information to begin with. And so, as a general rule, I will start with cortisol first. If you know, if the
Mm.
budget is limited, I will start with cortisol first because in my mind or my experience, that takes longer to go through because some of these people have been in this position with stress for a long time. And so, you know, they've really got a groove. They've really ground a groove in their, you know, in their the way they work. So we need to
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
fill that a bit, fill that wrinkle so they're better, and then by default, there, you know, some of their other hormones may better. So everyone knows that if a lady, a menstruating woman, is highly stressed or what have you, her periods can go tattars for a while.
Mm.
So now, is that the hormones' fault or the stress fault? Do you know what I mean? So sometimes if I deal with the stress response, so the sympathetic nervous system related to that, there is, you know, they may have a betterment for their less pain, or the periods might, you know, just get back on their track a bit more. And then
Mm.
my next step would be then to look at hormones. You know, we get the adrenal support going, so we're supporting their nervous system, their sympathetic nervous system. Usually, that's what you need to treat, and then we can bring in the others. And same with the bloke too. Though testosterone with a bloke, I definitely want blood testosterone so I can do the SHBG and the free testo, um, and then see what's going on there. Especially if it's an older gentleman who is really complaining about fatigue and they're not what they once were, and you know they're working their bum off at the gym but not getting the results. You know, sometimes that's low testo, and
Mm.
as you know, men's testosterone does diminish over time with age. Um, and so then they're not feeling vital because they're not having adequate testo, you know, and they prefer to go shoe shopping with their wife.
I,
So that's a
I
big
love our Aussie vernacular, Beth. And for our overseas listeners, I've got to explain that Australians will shorten a long word. So
oh
testo
no.
means testosterone. just just so you know.
Oh,
We'll put it in the
sorry.
show notes.
Yes,
I
please.
just
You'll
think it's
need a
hilarious.
glossary.
But
I
yeah,
know.
but
I
we
need
all do it.
a glossary.
Australians do it. Yeah.
We just put an O on the end of everything. And that doesn't help
Yeah.
because I'm also got Italian heritage, so I have to put an O on everything too.
Right.
And I'll start using my hands a bit more often. Um,
Little
so, yeah, so as I said before about the cortisol binding globulin, it is a protective mechanism, yeah, to
mm.
reduce the cortisol's damaging effects. That's what I mean when we put the rain on, so we don't have this blaring inflammation in our body, yeah. So,
Yeah.
so the lower DHEA levels will be a product of prolonged chronic stress activation. Yeah. And as I mentioned, aging, you're always going to see DHEA as a lower because, again, in our peak of our youth, our DHEA should be pumping, and then it declines over as we age. Of course, we can make that happen more sooner, but that's generally you expect. If you're comparing a 25-year-old to a 55-year-old, you would expect a DHEA base level as to be a bit lower. Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
And then
But we
generally,
want a
if we get
graceful
to the
decline rather than a precipitous fall.
oh God, yes, absolutely. Go in style, yeah, absolutely. So finally, stage 3 is where you'll see the low cortisol and low DHEA. So this would be more the exhaustion. Do you know what I mean? Again, there's an assumption here that the ACTH levels are constant and it is a failure of the adrenal glands to be keeping up, right? That's not necessarily the case. So while cortisol levels may reach a point of being considered low with associated low DHEA, this again is not necessarily due to the adrenal glands resistance, but rather just this chronic HPA downregulation and ensuing metabolic dysfunction, yeah, because then other things play into the part. You are not just your adrenals, yeah. So this depletion of metabolic reserves mean we are treating patients at this point can be challenging, and this is where it takes a lot of time. So this is where I like to start on that first, to start really kind of, I say building up, but it's just supporting the years of sympathetic nervous system dominance. Do you know what I mean? That these people have had.
Yeah.
Because then they will have, and you can see it, because that's when they can have the blood pressure and, the cholesterol and then, blood sugar issues. It's just everything starts packing in when it's been constantly revving. We've been revving. Yeah.
Can
I can see
ask
you're
a
about to
question
step
here?
in.
I am. Can I ask a question here? And that is, we commonly, frequently think about stress being an emotional upset. But indeed, you can have physical stressors. You can have heavy metals, which upset your sex hormone binding globulin and your cortisol response and things like that. So how do you look at something like, let's say, a cortisol awakening response or a daily cortisol
Yes.
test? When do you have to have alarm bells ringing to say, hang on, there could be a poisoning here? They could be a heavy metal toxicity or a persistent organochlorine pollutant toxicity going on.
Yeah, well, that's true. Unless they've got a very obvious history that, they used to go swimming in, Lake Goop somewhere or what have you. Or I had a client that lived down the road from an aluminium smelter. So hello, alarm bells.
Right.
But otherwise, it is tricky. And so that's why I still go back to basics. I'm not looking. I remember when I was trained in diagnostics, it was if you hear hooves galloping, just look for the horses first before you look for a zebra. Yeah. So it's looking for we know if they're telling you a story that, oh, my mother's in care and I'm looking after my sick child and my this, and, they got all these things. I'm not going to go straight to, I better check their heavy metals, right? I'm going to check their cortisol, help them with nervines and adaptogens and all that and support them that first. Because I find if you look at some of the core base things, this is where the gut comes into, you look at some core things, then see what symptoms are still there. Then you can go poking around. I think when we have all these new tests up our sleeve, and there's this test, that test, we get all excited. Oh, I'm going to give it to A, B, and C. I think it can distract us from keeping to our core, initial naturopathic things.
Surveillance.
We love guts. We love nervous systems. It's just, support. So that's where I would just be mindful of. And the other thing again, if we're looking at the adrenals, that rather than going into poisoning to start with, you've just got to look at some of the basics. And we mentioned Addison's, right? And so
Yeah.
this is where the stage of adrenal exhaustion that doesn't exist can be differentiated from true adrenal insufficiency condition, true conditions, because you do an ACTH blood test, and if that's a problem, then you have to get a short synaptin test, and that will determine whether they have true adrenal insufficiency or Addison's.
Right.
And I have discovered 3 patients with Addison's by following up on low cortisol levels. So we got, they were just flatlining on a saliva, and so then we did blood cortisol, and that was excessively low. I was like, Then we sent them on, and because you don't just go one test, you go, that might have just been an anomaly, because not every blood test is infallible. Sent them for another one and a short synaptin, and 3 clients we found with Addison's. That obviously these need to be pursued on with medical, a medical doctor.
And you can often pick these patients because they're eating like a horse and they just cannot put on weight. They just
sometimes
weight.
Because I actually had 2 sparrows. They were two little sparrow, wafy sort of people.
Yeah, they can't put on weight in Addison's. Yeah,
they can't put on weight, and they had a lot of comorbidities. So this is where you can't see the forest for the trees. Yeah. They had this, they had that, all these, and and this is when they get sent to that specialist. They get sent to all the different specialists, and I was like, oh, for God's sake, all of those conditions were because they had Addison's. So, and these people need long-term or lifelong hydrocortisone therapy, so they must be forwarded on. So if any practitioners are really concerned, please refer on. Do you know what I mean? Because hypocortisolism is a real thing. And so this, you also need mindful of histories again, because low cortisol can also be seen not just in Addison's, but in PTSD, in chronic fatigue syndrome, in fibromyalgia, some depressive and affective conditions, okay, which is rarely due to the adrenal function directly, but again is more likely to a response to the previous hypercortisol because, of trauma, or, it's trauma being so chronically fatigued. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
All those sorts of things. So you need to, again, we need the story about why would we expect to see that so low? Yeah. And so because consequences of this is the inflammation and the immune system and general, pain. It can be increased in pain. So, I think this is where it's more about the HPA axis, dysfunction I don't like either. It's because it's still a normal function of it trying to rein it in, when we're down-regulated.
That's very good. That's very wise. So, it's actually our body protecting us into hormone.
Exactly. So I think it's about homeostasis. So this way, even, is it a maladaptation? I don't even know about that, because it is about trying to not have us spontaneously combust. So it's yes, we'll need to have a think tank.
So maybe this is where, instead of these terms that we commonly use, we should indeed be looking at what you said earlier, terms that sit more naturopathically, like vitality, like nourishing, rather than blocking and upping and downing inside. We should be using these more seemingly wishy-washy terms, but indeed they're correct.
Yeah. Yes. And I do find then that clients, the amount of times that I go through so I use cortisol awakening response test, so and I can go through that and explain how that kind of works. I like that because then you get the picture on the paper to talk through with the client, and you can kind of say, see, this is you in the afternoon, in the mid-morning or the afternoon, and you're at a low number. So this is where, the chocolate biscuits and the coffee come in. This is when you're looking for a coffee and a biscuit. Yes. How do you know? Because you're looking for you're looking to pep yourself up again, and that's to get through the day. This is all about getting
Yeah.
through a normal day, you know.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of a slog for people, especially if you're being down-regulated and you're being rained and you've gone, but I got a deadline to get to,
Yeah. Just a question, I guess, about the cortisol awakening response test, which is 3 quick succession tests in the morning, versus the daily
Yeah.
cortisol test, which looks at diurnal variation throughout the day. Can you just forgive me to preface this? I find that there's quite a big discrepancy in the amount of the tests. Can you not just do a normal daily cortisol, but do them in quick succession as though you were doing a cortisol awakening response, a car? Because you
Oh,
save yourself, what is it, $40, $60?
yeah, but then you're not getting the proper reference ranges. Yeah.
Ah,
And I find that the lab won't give you a proper reference range because you're just going to do
right.
they're just random. Yeah, they're not set up to do that car response. If you just go, I did this every half an hour.
Yeah.
It buggers up the lab in that sense. They're just
Right.
not set up for that. But
No, fair
also
enough.
I want because I used to use the 4 diurnals because that's what we had.
Mm,
But the car
mm,
now is far more potent because you can have someone who during the day looks relatively okay with their numbers, as we discussed before, but their awakening response is backwards, or you
yeah.
can actually see that they wake up elevated, they go off the scale,
Drop.
and then they collapse, or so then well, this is now more about up here already putting the reins on. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is a lot of this
Um,
is this pre-anticipatory stress. Yeah.
yeah. Beth, there's so much to go into. I mean, this is a symposium in itself, but we need to get on to things like about how you support your patients. And obviously there's a lot
Yeah.
of psychology and a lot of counseling and things like that. But can we talk about supplements and lifestyle and dietary interventions that you use that you find work? Like,
Yeah.
for instance, ginsengs. We've got nervines. How many nervines at our
Yeah.
fingertips? We've also got nutrients, vitamin C, B5, the B complex, indeed. So what do you
Yeah.
use? What little hints and tips can you give us about
So
what
what
you find
I
works,
generally
what
do
might
is,
be
yeah.
cautionary things?
So generally I have a look at what they're doing in their life, and one thing that I find with a lot of people that are very exhausted and they're exhausted because they're running around in their head. What we have to remember is people think stress is running around like screaming. Okay. It's not just physical stress. It's not just, remember, over exercising is a stress, right? So there's that, but it's also the running around we do in our head, thinking, thinking, thinking. And
Mm.
practitioners know this because every client you see, you're thinking, 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 thinking. Well, how am I going to do this? What am I going to? It's constant. And even though I sit like this all day talking to people, it is exhausting because you constantly, it's an effort. You're using energy in your head. So I find
Yep.
that a lot of people, especially a lot of people now working from home, so if they're on the computer working from home, then it's like, well, and your home is your sanctuary, perchance, there's another stress if it's not. But, I often say, what do you do for joy? What do
Mm.
you do for joy? And it's surprising the number of people that have nothing. That there's crickets when I ask that question, so it's trying to find that to fill us up. Another thing is adequate and restful sleep, a restorative sleep in a
Mm.
dark room to help melatonin do its job, right, to counteract the cortisol. So you're getting restful and you're recharging. That helps recharge your batteries. That helps recharge your adrenals, is very important. And the number of people that, come to me with 5 hours sleep, what? That's unacceptable. We need, better
Mm.
sleep. Sun exposure. Again, if we're all working from home now, it's fine if you live in a sunny place and you can sit out in the veranda and tap away. But how many people are still just in a room, in an office room, without the sun. And sun is important again for our circadian, because of the circadian connection and the diurnal rhythms. Get out in the sun, start your day in the sun, Exercise is good just because you are expending some physical energy. So I generally, look, I'm happy if people just walk. Just go for a walk. Doesn't need to be the gym and Pilates and all of this, just movement, yeah? And breathing, correct breathing. I often teach people just so, not this shallow breathing where they breathe and their shoulders come up. It's actually belly breathing because that helps your heart rate variability too. Always look at their diet, of course, and especially if their cortisol is excessively high, I'll look at carbs because people will be having carbs to keep that kind of motor running. Or like I had a client once, she was, just high as a kite on the cortisol. She was highly anxious, and she told me how well she eats because she eats 10 serves of fruit a day. The trouble is that's all she ate in the day was 10 serves of fruit, which is basically, I call it sexy sugar. It's just feeding into that, it's feeding into that stress, because it's going to elevate the blood sugar and what have you. And then beautiful nervines. I love, things like your magnolia, your passion flower, carvers. I love carver. Especially in the evening if they're still a bit high in the evening. So if on a test they're high in the morning, you can't get in the morning to close those down. I usually make sure their nighttime is sedated, so they're calmed in the nighttime. So there's less of an aggravated rise for the morning. So again, if they're getting a better rechargeable sleep, they're less inclined to be meerkats first thing in the morning. Then, of course, there's lavender. That's my other one, is lavender. And there is a product out there that you can get magnesium and lavender, which I love it because it's very relaxing at nighttime for my clients and for myself. And then, of course, HPA access is the main target for any of our primary adaptogens, our herbal adaptogens. So they come in. Yes, there's the ginsengs. Now, I don't like Panax, especially for your wired and tired. They're already, sprung tight. Don't stimulate them anymore. And this is important if, back in the day when you would just go, someone come in and go, I'm tired, and you go, here's some Panax, that'll do the trick. It can make them feel way worse. So I do like more looking at my Siberian ginsengs, my American ginseng, my rhodiola. Rhodiola's lovely. And then, of course, Romania. Romania is good too for chronic stress. But then withania or your ashwagandha is fabulous because that can definitely strengthen your adrenal glands in response to external stresses and allow for a more positive stress response. This is really what we're looking for, is a more positive response rather than hysterical response. And that's where withania during heightened stress helps reduce that excessive, and there's you can get now products that have numerous proprietary extracts of withania, which is great. There's one is Sensoril, which uses root and leaf, which is a little bit different to what we traditionally use. But in clinical studies, that has been shown to have higher quantities of the standardized bioactives that we're looking for, which is excellent because they need less to get a good effect. And another sensory product is Shodan, which has been shown to have 21 bioactive, how do they say, withanolides, and it is one of the highest potency available, so it's incredibly zenifying. And so that is a ripper for your wired and tireds because it just is, I call it my herbal fluffy jumper, because it's just, or a cardigan, really. It's a nice, it's not too, it doesn't knock, it's a cardi, another Aussie vernacular is short for cardigan, but it's a fluffy cardigan, so it's just, warm and cozy, and it just very zenifying and, just chillaxing, really. And the other thing I like is, Withania,
Yeah, I
it's pretty,
like.
you can pretty much use that quite comfortably. Probably, as we're always a bit nervy with pregnancy, it doesn't seem like you can do anything with pregnancy. Even though I have used it, I just, monitor my dosing, but I find that, really nice. The other thing like is L-theanine, the amino
Hmm.
acid,
Hmm.
because that has been shown to reduce glutamate release and increase your inhibitory neurotransmitters such as GABA, which we know has an anti-anxiolytic effect, which is, again, is very important for that heightened cortisol in those first stages of the stress response. And it has been shown to improve alterations of HPA axis via modulating the diurnal rhythms of cortisone and ACTH. So that's
Okay.
ACE. Yeah. So again, that's another one that is really easy to, add to a magnesium powder or add to a smoothie, to just keep a steady Zen, thing going on.
Mm.
Actually, one
You take
study
quite high doses of
stated,
that too, can't you? Like 400 milligrams a day, and
yeah, though the studies that I was reading are just done 200 megs,
mm,
which is
yeah,
not a lot. And one study actually said that it had potential to promote mental health in the general population and stress-related ailments and cognitive impairments,
yeah,
that's the other thing that forget people. People kind of go, oh, and I'm losing my memory and I can't remember this and I can't this. It's because you're stressed out of your brain.
yeah, yeah.
You're not. This is when people think, oh, I think my mother had. I don't think you've got Alzheimer's just yet. I think you just, the monkeys are running around in your brain.
Mm,
And so you just can't remember everything. You have to write a
mm,
list. It's hard to
yep,
get through your day. But my
yep.
ultimate favourite is phosphatidylserine, which is a
Yes. So
phospholipid.
glad you mentioned this.
Um,
Yes.
Oh, I love it. I love it. And it's been a bit hard to get with various supply issues across the world, but it is a fave because it's kind of a quickie that you can take. It's a bit like a Panadol for your adrenals. It's like if you feel, so how I explain it to people is if when you feel like you're an 11 out of 10 on the anxiety scale,
Mm,
you pop your
mm,
phosphatidyle and within 15, 20 minutes, you're more down like a 7 out of 10. So then you can actually think a little bit clearer and, react or respond differently. So I
yeah.
find it great. You can't really OD on this. It just doesn't do anything
No,
if
you
you
need to
just keep
load.
popping them. But
Uh, what I've always said to people is the first month is going to be horrendously expensive because you'll be using like 3 or 4 bottles of, let's say 100 milligrams 4 times a day. So you do this low dose,
yes,
but from then on, it's like 100 milligrams a day. It's fine.
yeah, if that. I mean, I
Mm.
find now that for myself, even I just use it like a Panadol. When I just
Yeah.
feel, oh, here I'm, revving up too high. This just, if there's something happens, like if you have a bad incident in the traffic and you get fright, it's kind of like a rescue remedy sort of thing. It
Mm.
just brings it down because it's actually known to counteract exaggerated release of ACTH and cortisol. Yeah. So they even use it
Mm.
with athletes.
Athletes.
The
Yeah.
athletes use it to bring down the excess cortisol after the exercise. So
Mm.
that's why we probably can't, we're having trouble getting it. It's all at the Commonwealth Games at the moment for all the athletes over there. So yeah, it's wonderful because people can carry it around in their bag and just pop, whereas some of our herbs, withanias and our L-theanines and what have you are more like an ongoing thing. I feel like you
Mm.
say, once
Mm.
you've loaded with phosphatidyle and brought someone to a more manageable level, then they can just have it as like a little safety capsule there they can
Yeah.
have when they're
Yeah.
feeling
Yeah. Yeah.
a bit
Yeah.
wound up. So opposed to when they're feeling flat, this is more when they're feeling, the anxiety's coming to get them. And then, of course,
Gotcha.
you mentioned before vitamin C and the B complex. People get B complexes because, you need your Bs. And magnesium, they would be my magnesium and Bs would be your definite. And then you add your,
Mm.
what have yous. But again, I want to remind people about the different magnesiums on the market. And just because your client says, oh, yeah, I'm on a magnesium, you don't go, terrific, away you go. No, you've got to look at ones that are bioavailable. So there's things like magnesium glycerol phosphate, which is a combination of magnesium and phosphorus, and it has a very high magnesium content, over 12% higher than other organic salts, such as your lactates and your citrates. And clinical studies have shown that this is actually more readily assimilated and digested than other magnesium salts, even over aspartate and citrate. So that's something to be mindful.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And the other thing that I like, if someone's got a bath, is a magnesium salt bath, because they're fabulous relaxing.
Okay. Yeah.
And especially if you also you can add a little bit of lavender, essential oil into that bath. You might also have to then have a strainer handy to scoop those people out of the bath, because they will be so relaxed. Because definitely if I do that, I need to be ladled out and popped into bed, because it's good night from me.
Yeah.
That's the end
Beth,
of
there's
me.
so much that we could cover. It really is a seminar in itself, what we can do. Beth, thank you so much for taking us through these very salient points, and not just from the language, but also how we support our patients, how we tease apart what might be wrong. I love the way that you always go back to simple things. I will counter you in one thing you said, and that was that you said, if you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. Of course, that's unless you're in Africa, in which case you need to think of zebras. But I was talking about toxicity.
But you probably need to think of
working in a
lines
toxic environment. Yeah.
yes,
But
and
I
lines as
also
well.
love
But
the
yes,
way. I also love the way that you talk about not happiness, not exercise, but you talk about joy, and you also don't talk about how many hours of sleep. You talk about, did you get restful sleep? Was it rejuvenating for you? So it's these actually clinically meaningful terms, rather than that, as we spoke about earlier, that black box of a label that people use. I love the way that you actually care for your patients. It's wonderful to see. It's wonderful to podcast with you once again. Beth Bundy, thanks for joining us on Wellness by Designs for today.
My absolute pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Of course, all of the show notes and the other podcasts are going to be up on your favourite podcast app and the Designs for Health website. I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. This is Wellness by Designs.